Welcome to the FLAIR Equine Nasal Strip Training and Education Seminar. In this presentation, we'll discuss the benefits of FLAIR strips, how they work, and some of the amazing aspects of the equine athlete. Somebody sent us this photo to show that their horses wearing FLAIR strips ran first and second in a race. What caught our eye was the third horse. Notice where the soft tissue of the nose that lie over the nasal passages are being sucked in the airway, increasing resistance to breathing when oxygen is needed most. The blue arrow points to this. This is why we developed FLAIR strips in the first place. As an overview, FLAIR strips are clinically proven to make breathing easier and reduce fatigue, conserve energy, quicken recovery, and reduce lung bleeding that occurs during exercise, also known as exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage or EIPH. This webinar will go through an overview of how FLAIR equine nasal strips make breathing easier, a review of lung function and physiology, the benefits of breathing easier, which include conserving energy, reducing fatigue, quickening recovery, and reducing exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage, known as EIPH or lung bleeding, and will provide product information on how to store and apply FLAIR strips. FLAIR strips are drug-free, self-adhesive nasal strips that support horses' nasal passages and promote optimum respiratory health of equine athletes in all disciplines and at every level of competition. The strips benefit horses that work in all disciplines. FLAIR strips help horses breathe easier and compete at optimum performance, no matter if they're racing, barrel racing, eventing, show jumping, competing in polo, combined driving, endurance, steeplechase, or any other discipline. The strips also help horses at all levels of competition or training. Lower-level horses benefit as well as upper-level horses. Oftentimes, lower-level horses may not be as fit. They may be less athletic and may fatigue more easily. So even though they may not be competing at as high of a level, they may be working just as hard. Let's do an overview of how the strips work. Oxygen provides the body with energy to power exercise. Energy for exercise comes from a molecule called ATP, which is most efficiently made in the body using oxygen. Breathing easier makes it more efficient to take in oxygen to make the ATP that provides the energy needed to power exercise. Horses are obligate nasal breathers, so unlike humans, horses can only breathe through their nose. Let's start with a review of the respiratory system. The equine respiratory system starts at the nostrils and ends at the lungs. When a horse inhales, outside air passes through the nasal passages, down the trachea, and deep into the alveoli, or air sacs, of the lungs. There, the oxygen in the air diffuses into the pulmonary capillaries to be transported throughout the body to provide energy for exercise. The waste product of energy is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is transported out of the body by taking the reverse pathway. Blood carries carbon dioxide from the tissues back to the lungs, where it passes through the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli and is exhaled out of the body. During exercise, resistance to moving air into the lungs is increased, which makes it more difficult to move air in and out when horses need it most. About 50% of the resistance to getting air into the lungs during intensive exercise occurs near the very beginning, at the nasal passage, and particularly the nasal valve, the narrowest part of the upper airway. FLAIR strips work by supporting the tissues of the nasal passages that collapse during exercise. The reason this occurs can be seen when looking at the open area being pointed to by the arrow on the horse's skeleton on the right. This open area is called the nasoincisive notch. Unlike other structures of the respiratory system, skin and soft tissues overlying this notch are not supported by bone or cartilage, so it gets sucked into the nasal passages when breathing hard. The finger in the picture on the left is pushing down on the soft tissues that get sucked in when horses are exercising. FLAIR strips support the nasal passages, so it's easier for the horse to take in oxygen. This slide shows an endoscopic view inside a horse's nose at rest, showing the difference in the size of the nasal passage on the left without and on the right with a FLAIR strip. When horses exercise, the soft tissue over the nasal passage is sucked in as air is inhaled into the lungs, causing the airway to narrow, and resistance to flow increases when oxygen is needed most. The spring-like action in FLAIR strips supports the soft tissues over the nasal passages to reduce the collapse that occurs in all horses at the narrowest part of the upper airway. Physics shows us that small changes in the diameter of the airway cause large changes in the resistance to airflow. Imagine drinking a smoothie from a regular straw. It's hard to do. Using a FLAIR strip can be compared to drinking a smoothie from a large, fat straw. It's much easier to get what you need. The principle of POISEUELLE'S law tells us that for each increase in the size of a tube, the resistance to flow goes down 16-fold. Horses wearing FLAIR strips don't get more oxygen, they get the same amount of oxygen more easily. Throat conditions and head position affect efficiency of airflow to the lungs. While studies on the use of FLAIR strips to reduce the negative impact of these conditions have not been conducted, it has been shown that improving airflow anywhere along the upper airway will benefit horses in these situations. Now let's review lung function and physiology. The lungs transport the oxygen in the air to the rest of the body, but they have other functions too. In addition to transferring oxygen to the blood, they also remove carbon dioxide from the blood, are important in filtering particles that may be floating in the blood, and regulate the horse's body temperature. This means that the lungs are very important in helping the horse cool out after exercise. Horses' lungs have a total capacity of about 60 liters. However, big hearts and restrictive chest cavity means they can only use about 18 liters. Unlike bones, heart, and skeletal muscles, the lungs don't train with exercise. The amount of air moved in by an unfit horse is the same amount moved in when the horse is fit. Once it reaches the lungs, air is transported through many branching airways that resemble a tree and come to an end at the small air sacs called alveoli. The image on top shows the alveoli as grape-like structures that are surrounded by a network of capillaries carrying blood that changes from blue to red as the oxygen is loaded on board. The picture on the bottom is a model of the branching airways of a horse's lungs. This drawing is a cross-sectional view of the alveoli, illustrating that the oxygen in the alveoli diffuses through the pulmonary capillary membrane, or PCM, into the surrounding pulmonary capillaries to be carried throughout the body. The PCM is very efficient at permitting diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli to the blood, but it's also very fragile. The photo on the left is a magnified human hair. The PCM, shown on the right, is the thin wall between the alveolus and the red blood cells. It's only 1/100th the thickness of a human hair. We'll talk more about this fragile membrane later. Let's talk about the function and physiology of the lungs when the horse picks up the pace and needs more energy. When a horse's exercise intensity increases, two major things happen. There's an increase in oxygen intake, and more blood is pumped to bring the oxygen to the heart, diaphragm, and muscles when they need it most. Let's talk about how a horse increases oxygen intake. During exercise, the horse starts to breathe deeper and faster to bring more air into the lungs and to breathe carbon dioxide out. When galloping fast, about 2 4-gallon buckets of air move in and out of the horse's lungs every second. You can also think of it as 9 55-gallon barrels full of air every minute. In addition, as speed increases during a canter and gallop, a horse's stride and breathing become in sync, so that a horse takes one breath for each stride, about 120 to 140 per minute. As a horse moves faster, its legs don't move faster. Rather, the horse extends the length of its stride. Because breathing and stride are linked, anything that impacts breathing impacts stride, and vice versa. At a gallop and faster, the horse's chest behavior also changes. At rest, walking, or trotting, a horse brings air in by expanding its ribcage like people do. However, when galloping, the horse's ribcage becomes rigid, and the diaphragm moves back and forth like a plunger in a syringe to pull air in and push it out of the lungs. This occurs in sync with the horse's stride, with the legs and body acting like a giant bellows to move the massive amounts of air in and out of the lungs. When the horse begins to throw its legs forward in the early part of the stride, it's like opening a bellows, creating a strong negative pressure, a suction force or vacuum, to pull air into the lungs. Because breathing and stride are linked, anything that impacts breathing impacts stride. Another thing to consider for horses that jump is when jumping, a horse doesn't breathe. And if there's another obstacle to be jumped which requires a bounce or even a single stride, he will not take another full breath until clearing the next fence. This means that for about a third of a show jumping round, the horse is unable to move air in or out. Thus, to perform optimally, the horse needs to be able to move air in and out as efficiently as possible between jumps. So now, let's discuss the proven benefits of horses breathing easier with FLAIR strips, including conserving energy, reducing fatigue, quickening recovery, and reducing lung bleeding. By breathing easier with FLAIR strips, horses have been shown to use 5 to 6% less energy during intensive exercise. Studies also show that when using FLAIR strips, that horses fatigue less. This is because if the resistance to air intake is reduced, less energy is used to bring in the same amount of air. Effective recovery after exercise is critical. The faster a horse recovers, the more energy they have available for tomorrow. After exercise, horses are hot and breathing hard or blowing. Blowing helps horses cool out by moving cool air through the lungs. However, just like when the horse is working, the soft tissue over the nasal passages collapse during blowing because the horse is inhaling deeply. FLAIR strips support the nasal passages after exercise, so they collapse less, leading to a more efficient intake of cool air. Horses cool out more quickly. To get the most benefit from FLAIR strips, leave the strip on until the horse has completely cooled out. In fact, the strip can be left on the horse until the adhesive wears and it falls off, or the horse rubs it off. Let's discuss how FLAIR strips reduce exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage, also known as EIPH or lung bleeding. This is the presence of blood in the airways during or following exercise. Recall that as the horse picks up the pace, it increases its oxygen intake. Now we'll talk about the increase in blood flow to move the oxygen throughout the body. Two major things occur to increase blood flow during exercise. First, blood volume increases as more red blood cells become available. The blood volume increases by increasing the number of circulating red blood cells, which are stored in the horse's spleen. When you warm your horse up, its spleen contracts, pushing the red blood cells stored inside into circulation for use during exercise. That's why warming your horse up before exercise is so important, to make sure they have sufficient red blood cells to provide for the increased oxygen demand. Second, the heart pumps at an increased rate and with increased force to move the blood faster. Another thing that occurs to increase blood flow is that the heart beats faster and pumps harder. In fact, the horse's heart rate can go up to over 220 beats per minute. When going this fast, the horse is pushing 3 pints of blood out with every beat. The amount of blood going through the lungs is over 75 gallons every minute. When blood volume and heart rate goes up, so does blood pressure throughout the body, including in pressure in the pulmonary capillaries in the lungs, causing these vessels to expand like a balloon. The blood pressure in the pulmonary capillaries during intensive exercise increases 4-fold. Now let's recall our earlier discussion of the large suction forces that occur when horses are breathing air in at high speed. This strong suction force creates a negative pressure or vacuum pulling on the outside of the pulmonary capillaries. So let's look at what's happening inside the lungs when breathing and blood flow are increased. At the level of the PCM, on one side, the horse's stride and diaphragm are exerting a strong vacuum force, shown by the black arrow, that's pulling the PCM outward. On the other side, a high blood pressure, shown by the red arrow inside of the pulmonary capillary, is pushing on the PCM. This means the PCM is under a lot of stress. The combined pushing and pulling forces on the pulmonary capillary membrane cause the membrane to rupture. This is exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage, also referred to as EIPH or bleeding. It is a condition where blood spills out of the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli during exercise. The photo on the right is an electron micrograph showing a red blood cell coming out of the pulmonary capillary where the membrane has ruptured. EIPH is a silent injury. While nearly all exercising horses experience this bleeding, only 5% or less of horses show blood at the nostrils. All horses bleed, even during low-intensity exercise. This shows different levels of bleeding with an endoscope in the trachea. Many factors have been shown to contribute to the occurrence of EIPH, such as age, genetics and sex, hard surfaces, distance, speed, and weight carried, environmental conditions, altitude, seasons, jumping, allergies, inflammation and infection, heart disorders, upper airway obstructions, and intense training schedules. Some signs that may tell you your horse has experienced EIPH include clear or white nasal discharge, blood coming from the nose after exercise, coughing after exercise, poor performance, blowing for a long time after exercise, or frequent swallowing during cool-out. EIPH is traumatic to the lungs, and each incident forms scar tissue and irritation that can shorten a horse's competitive career. To illustrate, the lungs on the left are healthy, pink lungs. The purple-tinged lungs on the right are from a chronic bleeder. Using FLAIR strips is an easy way to protect a horse's lungs and reduce lung bleeding. While nothing has been shown to stop bleeding, only 2 things have been proven to reduce bleeding: FLAIR strips and the drug furosemide, also known as Lasix. FLAIR strips are drug-free and have been proven to be as effective as Lasix in reducing lung bleeding during high-intensity exercise. To summarize how Lasix and FLAIR strips work, on the left, the positive blood pressure, which is shown by the red arrow, pushes on the pulmonary capillary membrane, and the negative pressure or suction is shown by the black arrow below, pulling on that PCM. On the right, with FLAIR and Lasix, the push and pull pressures are reduced. Lasix is a diuretic that reduces the high internal pressure pushing on the PCM by causing the horse to urinate high volumes of fluids. FLAIR strips work by reducing the negative pressure pulling on the PCM by reducing the resistance to breathing air in. Both work to reduce the pressure being exerted on the PCM, so the membrane is less likely to rupture. FLAIR strips and Lasix can be used together. The benefits of FLAIR strips have been proven in numerous clinical studies that have been conducted at leading universities and published in major equine veterinary publications and textbooks. FLAIR strips help horses perform at their best. The strips are scientifically proven to make breathing easier, reduce fatigue, conserve energy, quicken recovery, and reduce lung bleeding that occurs during exercise. For best results, store FLAIR strips at room temperature. Sometimes we hear a FLAIR strip didn't adhere properly to a horse's nose. If the strip is exposed to extreme heat or cold, it may not adhere properly. Do not store them in hot vehicles, as that can negatively affect the quality of the medical grade adhesive. Apply the strips at room temperature. If it's chilly outside, we recommend placing the strip inside your jacket for a few minutes before applying to allow the strip to warm up. Applying FLAIR strips is relatively straightforward. To help with the application process, we've included detailed instructions on our packaging and in our YouTube videos. If you have any questions or problems with applying strips, please contact us. Make sure the horse's nose is clean and dry. It is very important to bend the side edges of the strip along the score mark. This helps to prevent the edges from lifting. The adhesive liner has 3 pieces. The middle piece is designed for use as a handle, so you don't have to touch the adhesive of the strip when applying the strip on your horse's nose. Lastly, make sure to position the strip on your horse so that the top of the strip lies right where the soft tissue starts to not be fully supported by bone. For most horses, this placement is where the bottom of the strip is about 2 finger widths above the nostril. Here are some application tips. Apply at least 30 minutes prior to exercise, riding, or any other activity that might cause the horse to sweat. It's important to apply strips to a clean, dry nose. Remove dirt and oil prior to applying by using a dry cloth, such as a microfiber towel or a paper towel. We know some riders will use a piece of vet wrap instead of a cloth because the tackiness on vet wrap can also help lift dust and dirt off the hair. Lastly, brush the hair on the nose upward. This can create more surface area for the FLAIR strip adhesive to stick to. It's really important you do not use water, gels, or any oils on the nose because the FLAIR strip adhesive is designed to stick to hair. Therefore, anything that creates a barrier between the strip and hair will cause the strip to not stick well. Additional adhesives may be harmful and aren't recommended. Lastly, please remember to not shave the horse's nose prior to applying. FLAIR strips have a unique adhesive that is designed to flow into and adhere to the horse's hair. FLAIR strips are a single-use product. Leave the strip on until the horse is fully cooled out and breathing has returned to normal. When you remove FLAIR strips, do not remove by pulling up or down. Peel gently but firmly from the top corner toward the middle. The adhesive used on FLAIR strips may cause slight loss of hair, as experienced with normal shedding. We appreciate feedback and encourage you to contact us with any questions, comments, ideas, or concerns. Thank you for taking time to learn more about the benefits of FLAIR strips. We look forward to working together to help horses breathe easier so they can perform their best.